In 2015, a behavioral research institute in Europe launched a confidential psychological study designed to measure how quickly trust could collapse inside a controlled community when small inconsistencies were introduced into daily life. And the participants selected for this experiment were unaware that they were part of the study, as they believed they had simply joined a remote living program in exchange for free accommodation, food, and work opportunities in a shared residential environment that resembled a modern small town with cafes, offices, apartments, and communal spaces. At first, everything functioned normally, with participants forming natural social groups, developing routines, and interacting casually as strangers would in any new environment. But within the first 2 weeks, researchers began introducing extremely subtle modifications into the system, such as slightly altering timestamps on digital clocks, changing minor details in shared announcements, and adjusting information consistency between different communication channels. And while none of these changes were significant enough to be immediately noticeable individually, their cumulative effect slowly began creating confusion in perception. Some participants started reporting that they remembered events differently from others, such as conversations that one group clearly recalled but another denied ever happening, or shared schedules that appeared slightly misaligned, depending on which building they were in. And at first, these inconsistencies were dismissed as memory errors or stress-related confusion. But as the discrepancies increased, a more disturbing pattern emerged, suggesting that the environment itself was being manipulated to test how humans react when their sense of shared reality begins to fracture. By the 4th week, researchers introduced a controlled misinformation layer into the system, where different groups were given slightly altered versions of the same daily instructions. And although the changes were small, they were enough to create conflicting interpretations of events, and this led to the first noticeable breakdown in group trust, as participants began questioning each other's reliability rather than questioning the environment itself, which was exactly the behavioral shift the study was designed to measure. As tensions increased, small social divisions began forming inside the community, with individuals aligning themselves based on perceived consistency of memory and communication accuracy, and what started as minor disagreements over routine details gradually escalated into full-scale distrust between groups, where participants started documenting their own experiences privately to defend their version of events, effectively creating parallel realities within the same physical space. The research team closely monitored these developments and observed that the most significant behavioral change was not confusion, but the rapid decline of interpersonal trust, because once individuals could no longer rely on shared confirmation of reality, they stopped cooperating instinctively and began isolating themselves into smaller clusters, relying only on those who confirmed their version of events, even when those confirmations were objectively incorrect. By the 6th week, the experiment reached a critical point when a coordinated misinformation shift was introduced across all communication channels simultaneously, but intentionally staggered by milliseconds between different devices, and this caused a complete breakdown in synchronization, leading participants to receive slightly different versions of the same announcement at the same time, which resulted in widespread disagreement about basic facts such as meeting locations, scheduled tasks, and even the timing of meals. And this moment marked the beginning of full psychological destabilization within the group. Researchers noted that once trust collapsed beyond a certain threshold, participants stopped attempting to verify information objectively and instead began relying entirely on social reinforcement, meaning that the most confident voices, regardless of accuracy, began shaping group perception, and this created a hierarchy of belief rather than truth, where reality was no longer determined by facts, but by consensus strength. As the experiment continued, emotional stress levels increased significantly, and participants began exhibiting signs of paranoia, constantly recording interactions, comparing notes, and challenging each other's memories, which further accelerated the fragmentation of social structure. And what was most concerning to the researchers was how quickly normal cooperative behavior dissolved when consistent reality validation was removed. By the 8th week, several participants requested to leave the program, reporting that the environment felt unstable and untrustworthy. But their requests were initially delayed under procedural review protocols, and during this period, the misinformation system reached its peak complexity, with overlapping inconsistencies introduced across multiple layers of communication, making it nearly impossible for any participant to form a stable understanding of shared events. Eventually, the study was terminated earlier than planned due to ethical concerns raised by external observers reviewing partial data leaks, and participants were gradually extracted from the environment and debriefed. At which point many expressed confusion and distress upon learning that their entire lived experience had been part of a controlled psychological experiment designed to measure trust collapse under engineered reality distortion. The final research findings revealed a disturbing conclusion. Human trust is not primarily based on truth itself, but on the stability of shared perception. And once that stability is disrupted even slightly, social structures begin to fracture far faster than expected, regardless of intelligence, background, or awareness. And perhaps the most unsettling implication of the experiment was not what it proved about deception, but what it revealed about reality itself. That what humans consider truth is often just the most commonly reinforced version of events, not necessarily the most accurate one. Following the termination of the experiment, researchers began a deeper analysis phase to understand not just what happened during the study, but why the breakdown of trust occurred so rapidly despite the participants being intelligent, socially functional individuals with no prior indication of extreme psychological vulnerability. And what they discovered in post-experiment interviews was even more revealing than the behavior observed during the trial itself, because many participants consistently described a growing sense of uncertainty about their environment that they could not logically explain, even after being informed that their experiences had been manipulated. One participant explained that the most disturbing aspect was not the obvious inconsistencies, but the subtle ones that felt almost natural at first, like remembering a conversation slightly differently than someone else, or noticing that written instructions seemed to change tone depending on where they were read. And although these variations were extremely small in isolation, they created a cumulative psychological effect where individuals began doubting not only their surroundings, but their own memory stability, which ultimately became the core mechanism of trust breakdown inside the system. Researchers later identified that the human brain relies heavily on external confirmation to stabilize perception, meaning that when multiple people agree on an experience, the mind categorizes it as reality. But when that agreement begins to fracture even slightly, the brain compensates by increasing reliance on emotional certainty rather than factual consistency. And this shift was exactly what the experiment unintentionally amplified, because once participants started encountering conflicting versions of shared events, they no longer had a stable reference point for objective validation. As the data was reviewed in greater detail, a secondary pattern emerged that had not been fully recognized during the live experiment, which was that participants were not just losing trust in each other, but were also gradually altering their own recollection of events to align with whichever version of reality felt most socially reinforced at the time, meaning that memory itself was becoming fluid under pressure, reshaping itself based on group influence rather than objective accuracy. And this discovery raised serious questions about how human memory functions in unstable social environments outside controlled conditions. In one of the final debrief sessions, several participants reported experiencing what they described as reality lag, where they would hear or observe something, but only become fully confident in what they saw after someone else confirmed it, suggesting that perception alone was no longer sufficient to establish certainty, and instead required external validation before being accepted as real, which demonstrated a complete dependency shift from internal cognitive processing to social confirmation loops, a phenomenon that had never been documented at this scale in prior behavioral studies. Further analysis showed that the most significant collapse point in the experiment occurred when conflicting information was introduced simultaneously across different communication channels, because this created a situation where no single version of reality could dominate long enough to stabilize group consensus, and instead multiple competing interpretations of the same event began coexisting, forcing participants into fragmented belief clusters where each group believed they were experiencing the correct version of reality while rejecting all others as incorrect or manipulated. What made this especially concerning to researchers was how quickly these belief clusters became emotionally reinforced. Because once individuals aligned themselves with a particular version of events, they began defending it not through evidence, but through social loyalty, meaning that truth became secondary to group identity, and this shift transformed disagreements from informational conflicts into emotional conflicts, significantly accelerating the breakdown of cooperative behavior within the environment. As the experiment moved into its final phase before shutdown, researchers observed that even simple tasks such as coordinating meeting times or sharing resources require negotiation rather than assumption, because participants could no longer trust shared instructions without verification. And this introduced delays, misunderstandings, and repeated conflicts that further weakened the remaining structure of cooperation, creating a cascading effect where inefficiency reinforced distrust and distrust reinforced fragmentation. One of the most unexpected findings came after the study ended, when researchers analyzed communication logs and discovered that certain participants had independently developed internal verification systems, such as cross-referencing multiple individuals before accepting any information or deliberately delaying decisions until consensus could be observed, which suggested that humans naturally attempt to rebuild stability even in artificially destabilized environments. But these adaptive behaviors were not strong enough to fully counteract the engineered inconsistencies introduced during the experiment. The final conclusion drawn from the extended research was not that humans are easily deceived, but rather that human social reality is extremely dependent on synchronized perception. And once that synchronization is disrupted beyond a certain threshold, reality itself becomes fragmented into multiple competing versions, each of which feels equally valid to those experiencing it, even when they're objectively inconsistent with one another. And perhaps the most important implication of the entire study was that trust is not simply a psychological preference or social convenience, but a structural requirement for shared reality, meaning that without it, even accurate information loses meaning because it cannot be reliably distinguished from false information in a fragmented perception environment. Even years after the experiment concluded, researchers continued to reference its findings in discussions about digital misinformation, social media echo chambers, and information overload, because the same principles observed in the controlled environment appeared to be naturally emerging in real-world communication systems at scale, suggesting that the experiment had not created a new problem, but had instead revealed an existing vulnerability in how human societies construct and maintain shared understanding. And in that sense, the experiment did not just measure trust collapse inside a closed system. It demonstrated how fragile the boundary is between shared reality and fragmented perception, and how easily that boundary can begin to dissolve when consistency is disrupted even slightly over time.